Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the cardiac function curve. And so this function curve is based off of some parameters that we should go over first. And I'm just going to break it down really simple, kind of go through the process of why that parameter either increases or decreases venous return and how that affects the graph. You can see it in the back. So first we're going to go through this really quick, and then we'll go through the graph itself. Because if you can't understand this, then you're not going to understand the graph. Okay, so first we're going to talk about things that increase venous return to the heart and in turn increase cardiac output, right? Because the more blood you return back to the heart, that same amount of blood, it has to be pumped out. So that's why when you get more venous return, you'll get a higher cardiac output. So the first thing that's going to increase that is an increase in blood volume, which makes sense, right? Because if you have a higher volume of blood, then that means you can return more to the heart and more will be pumped out. Okay, so the second thing is a decrease in venous compliance. So if a vessel is compliant, that means it's more stretchy, and so that means more blood can fill it, right? And so what we have to understand is if you have the heart and the heart gets pumped, when it pumps the blood, first it goes into the arteries, right? So we'll do like thick lines for the arteries, and then it goes to veins, and our veins are thinner, they're more compliant. There's a lower pressure here compared to a higher pressure here. And then after the veins return the blood to the heart, right? So if the veins are less compliant, then that means that the veins are less likely to hold the blood, because veins can distend, and when they distend, they can hold more blood because of their lower pressure. And so if the vessel wall, if it's less compliant, that means it's going to hold less blood. And so instead of distending and opening up, it's going to stay closed, right? And if you can picture like squeezing, it's going to stay closed, so it's going to push the blood to the next area, which is the heart. So if the veins are less compliant, they're holding less of the blood. Instead of holding the blood, instead of being distended, they're going to come together, and it's going to push the blood to the heart. And so that's why you get an increase in venous return when the veins are less compliant. Okay, and then the last thing here we'll talk about is a decrease in arteriolar resistance. So this is kind of like with the veins, right? So if you have less resistance, that means you have more flow, right? In anything, like a tube or something, right? If there's less resistance, the more flow. So here are the arteries. There's less resistance, so more blood is going to be able to flow through to the veins, and there's more that'll be able to return to the heart. So an increase in venous return and an increase in cardiac output. Okay? And so now we're going to talk about parameters that decrease venous return. So here it's kind of similar just to the ones that increase it. So the ones that decrease it is just going to be the opposite. So it's going to increase in blood volume. Oh, sorry. Decrease in blood volume. Right? So less blood flow, less return to the heart, the lower the cardiac output. So decrease in blood volume, an increase in venous compliance, right? So the veins are more compliant, they're more likely to distend and open up, and they're going to store more blood instead of pushing it to the heart, because they're going to open up. They're going to literally distend. They're more compliant to hold the blood. Okay. And then the last thing, again, is just the opposite. it's going to increase in arteriolar resistance. So like we said, if the arterioles are if they have a higher resistance, it's going to be harder for the blood to get through, right? Because there's more resistance here, harder for the blood to get through, so less of the blood is going to get to the veins, and then less blood is going to get to the heart. And so overall, that's going to decrease venous return. It's going to decrease how much blood gets back to the heart, and then decrease cardiac output. And so next we'll talk about the graph. All right, so for the cardiac function curve, first we're going to label the curves. So the easiest one, as you can see, the middle one is the resting one, and this beautifully drawn symbol of something, that is the center. And so we're going to move, the questions are going to be, if we move from the center to a point, right, and I'm going to say, increase in inotropy does what to the graph? And you have to say, if I start here and increase in inotropy, that increases contractility, so that'd go to point C, right? Or something like that. And so first we have to label what each curve is, and then later we can talk about the changes. So the easiest one to start with is you can see we have the main one in the middle here, that's the resting one, and then we have one that's going above it like that, the same way, and then below it the same way. And so those are just contractility. So the one above, the one higher, that would be an increase in contractility. Okay, and then the one below it, that change would be considered a decrease in contractility. And so if they give you something in a question that says, this drug increases contractility, what is the change going to be from resting, right? And so you would just go up to that line, this increasing contractility line, starting from the resting position. And so increasing contractility would be to C, right? Because if we went to B, that intersects with a different line. And we'll talk about that one. Okay, so those are increasing contractility and decreasing contractility. Now let's talk about the lines. Let's talk about these lines. So let's start with volume. So just like we talked about for the parameters, right? If we have an increase in volume, increase in blood volume, that's an increase in venous return and an increase in cardiac output, right? So increase in volume has to be, so it's going to be one of these four lines. So if you can guess which one it is, you just look at the axes. So this is labeled cardiac output and venous return. So that corresponds to volume, right? So it has to be increase in volume. If this is the baseline, so it's going to be an increase in volume. So it has to be one of these lines. So it's going to be the highest line. That one is going to be an increase in volume, like blood volume. It's also a decrease in compliance, right? Because this is, right here we're talking about venous return. So if there's a decrease in compliance of the veins, then that means that blood is getting, again, it's not being distended, it's being squeezed together, and the blood is being pushed to the heart, increasing venous return, increasing cardiac output. And so that's why it's also on this line. So that's what J and A and F correspond to. Okay, so just like there's an increase in volume, there can also be a decrease in volume. So it's just going to be the opposite side. So this line represents a decrease in volume. So let's label that. So this is decrease in volume. Okay, and since this is a decrease in compliance, this is going to be an increase in compliance. And we're talking about venous compliance here. But I'm just going to put compliance because it's just shorter. Okay, So now we labeled most of them. We only have two left. We have this one and this one. Okay, so for K, that's intersecting here. So this is going to be a decrease in arteriolar tone or resistance, right? Remember we said a decrease in resistance allows more blood to flow to the veins, right? And so that's why you see it's up here, because more blood flows to the veins if there's a decrease in arteriolar tone or arteriolar resistance. There's a decrease in resistance. So that way there's an increase in blood going to the veins, and that'll cause an increase in venous return. And so that's why it's one of these lines up here. Okay, so that's a decrease in arterial tone. So you can guess the other one. So the other one is an increase in arteriolar tone. And that's it. So now they're all labeled. So whenever you get a question that relates to changes in volume, changes in compliance of the veins or the arteries, then you can just look at the graph. Most likely they'll give you a graph, and then figure out the changes from there.